Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast-forward planet, sadly still wrapped in a pandemic that emerged a little over a year ago in circumstances that our scientists are still probing. Clearly, somewhere in China, there was a crossover, a virus that had a home in one species, crossed over into another, and then into human beings. And within 4 months, one of the most remarkable headlines that I saw came in April, which was the first time that this virus had started to infect people in the Amazon rainforest. So it had gone around the world through our circulatory system that we have, and had so that it's a worldwide peril, and we're still dealing with that now in ways that are going to play out for years to come, even with the vaccine emerging happily through, again, heroic work by scientists. I'm Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And today's Sustain What session is on a topic that's highly relevant to the state of the planet right now. Of course, the other reality is that scientists have just announced that we're pretty much guaranteed to have the highest temperatures on this planet recorded since the 1850s, since 1870s, since temperatures were starting to be recorded with some precision. The planet is warming, the planet is hyper-connected, and one of the key elements to conserving both our planetary health and the climate is conserving forests around the world. One of the keystones there is guaranteeing the right of people who have lived productively in those forests for, in many cases, millenniums, and in other cases, like those of rubber tappers in the Amazon, for example, who've moved in there, the forest 100 years ago, are local communities that are finding a way to be sustainably working in the forest. Protecting those lives and those rights is a keystone to fostering planetary health and conserving biodiversity and limiting climate change through the role of forests in absorbing carbon. I have a really valuable array of guests here this morning to explore this issue from the end of, from research end. Peer-reviewed research will be laid out for the first time that clarifies this picture that I just described. And there are two Indigenous representatives who've come on despite the time zone challenges we all face to present the story of conservation possibilities from their end of this landscape. So thank you very much for being with us today. Please share the link you're watching on right now, and you can start to share this discussion live with others around the world. And I just want to make sure all of my guests are here. We've had a little bit of some of the usual snafus this morning. I did want to start with one little visual that I think really makes the point very powerfully what the presence of indigenous peoples can mean for forests. I wrote a book about the Amazon rainforest back in 1990, the burning season. I got to know many forest peoples. There was an alliance of the peoples of the forest at that time. And the Xingu forest back then was being assailed. You can see here, just watch briefly, and you'll see satellite images showing you what happens around this area as opposed to within the area. And if that doesn't say there's a value to having communities on the land productively using it in ways that are historic, and then I don't know what does. So that's the starting point. And now we're going to get to our guests, and thank you again for being with us this morning. Hold on. I think Peter Veit is, let's see, we have Jeff Sachs. Right, here we go. So this is going to be a brisk discussion. There are journalists on the line who'll be sending in questions. You, wherever you are, can send in questions as well through the links on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter via Periscope. It's great to have you all here. Just to give you a brief introduction to our guest, Peter Dayak is president of EcoHealth Alliance, a US-based organization that conducts research and outreach programs on global health, conservation, and international development. He's an author of the recently published IPBES report. It's a biodiversity assessment. You'll hear that acronym a little bit more. We'll try to stay mostly acronym-free on the links between the degradation of vulnerable ecosystems and a corresponding spike in pandemic risk if something is not done. He's also the author of a recent paper in Science, the journal Science, on strategies for reducing deforestation in order to mitigate future pandemic risk. Peter Veit is director of Land and Resource Rights, the Land and Resource Rights Initiative at the World Resources Institute. In the 5 years since the Paris Agreement on climate change was signed, that treaty and the biodiversity assessment both concluded that tropical forests are vital. Conserving tropical forests is a vital goal for addressing climate change. The problem is that this is not yet, the presence of people on the landscapes in these places is not yet fully integrated into these reports. The question there is, can we make it more clear that safeguarding land rights of indigenous peoples and conservation-minded local communities is a strategy for conserving forests and reducing pandemic risk. Great to have you here, Peter. I know there's been a connection problem. And if you are out again, I'll get you back in a second. Norman Jiwan is a Kerambai Dayak from West Kalimantan, that's the Indonesian side of the giant island called Borneo. He's an activist who works for the Indonesian NGO Sawit Watch. It's a watchdog group that tracks the palm oil industry in the region. And palm oil, as we all know, is the boom in palm oil is one of the most devastating factors eating into tropical forests. Initially all in Southeast Asia, but now palm oil is spreading around the world too. Sawit Watch tracks the palm oil industry in the region. He'll tell you about a series of case studies in Borneo that get at these points we're making. Jeffrey Sachs will be with us, my friend and colleague from Columbia University. He's has a rare title. He's a university professor at Columbia. He's director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He's also co-chair of the Science Panel for the Amazon. We'll learn more about that in a couple of minutes. I helped to produce some of their reports. And Pam McElwee is associate professor in the Department of Human Ecology in the School of Environment and Biological Sciences at Rutgers. She's a lead author of Chapter 6 in this report, the Biodiversity Assessment. And she'll tell you more about the findings that she has both in that writing and in some of her own peer-reviewed research that, again, articulates clearly in data that the presence of indigenous communities on land is an attribute for conservation. Finally, Mina Susanna Setra is with us. And again, thank you so much to both Mina and to Norman for coming to us at an odd hour for where they are. She's an indigenous Dayak Kompang from West Kalimantan, Indonesia also. She has worked on indigenous environment and climate policy at Indonesia's Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, AMAN, A-M-A-N, which represents 17 million Indonesians. Remember, there's something like 16,000 islands in Indonesia. It's a huge and wonderful country. I haven't been there since 1979. And I only tasted a little bit of the splendor of that area. And that was before a lot of the destruction has unfolded. You'll hear Mina will provide kind of a final capping thought here. We will have time for questions, so you can get them through, the journalists who are on the line can do this through the contacts they have, and anyone else can do it through the text box where you are. So that's the introduction. We have a lot of people and a lot of territory to cover here, and let's get to it. I mean, here's Jeff Sachs. Good morning, Jeff.
How are you? Finally got in the room. Good to be with you.
No, I'm sorry. I know it's a little complicated, but I'm glad you're here. And how are you doing, by the way? We're all
very well, thank you.
All right. So let's get started with Peter Dayak. You've been in the news for months. You've been on my show, this program, for a couple of times, talking about these links between ecological disruption and the pandemic that emerged and the pandemics we still face going forward. So thank you for being here, and fill us in a little bit on your findings and your clarion call for where we go from here.
Well, I'm going to start with some thoughts about. Hang on, let me just try and share screen here.
Yeah, it should come in. Try it again. There was too many people who were in the green room munching on the pretzels. And apparently there's this name of them.
So hopefully you can see this.
There they are, yeah.
So I'm going to start with the origins of COVID, and let's try and think about how that fits in with the bigger issue, which is pandemic risk to our planet, and where do these diseases come from? Why do they emerge? And we've been working on this now for about 2 decades, trying to understand the trends in emerging diseases, some of which become pandemic. What we know is most of them originate in animals, and most of those originate in wildlife. They seem to emerge in places with a high population density or where there's a high wildlife diversity, and places where there's a lot of environmental change. So the hotspot map represents these areas on the planet where we think there's a supreme risk of the next pandemic. And you can see straight away that Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central West Africa, and South America are hotspots. So is Europe, so is North America. There's a lot of foodborne infections that originate there. But when you look at the map on the bottom right there, that's a picture of the predicted unknown viruses that exist in wildlife, specifically bats. We know that SARS-CoV-2 is probably a bat origin virus, so was SARS. It's probable that Ebola is, and there are a whole series of other high-risk viruses. Latin America is a real hotspot for diversity, especially in the Amazon region, for bat diversity, for mammalian diversity, and for the diversity of their viruses. So what happens on the planet is as people encroach into those habitats, and as we push and push and push, we reach thresholds at which viruses that probably spilled over gradually for the past, hundreds of thousands of years, eventually emerge and spread. Why is this happening now? Why is it increasing? And we've got really good evidence that pandemic risk is increasing. And of course, the answer is our activities on the planet are increasing at an exponential rate in many cases. You can see at the bottom on the left, tropical forest loss, a key driver, a globally significant driver of pandemic risk. And that's directly because we're expanding agriculture, we're expanding our development to produce stuff for consumption. And there's a chain of consumption that starts often with the richer countries, global demands for things like palm oil, for fur, for wildlife products, that drives an industrialization of things that have already been going on for many thousands, tens of thousands of years, that haven't previously led to pandemics. Things like hunting wildlife, which is a mode of sustenance for local communities around the world, indigenous peoples everywhere, but has now become industrialized. So really, when we look at COVID, we're looking at 2 things, I think, that are coming together in Southeast Asia and very specifically in South China. Traditional lifestyles bumping up against an incredibly fast-paced modern development of China. Roads being built into the forest, forests being converted to agriculture, high-speed rail links linking cities and towns so people can get their products quicker to market. And those products include wildlife, live wildlife, which is still consumed extensively across Southeast Asia and extensively in southern China, but is now farmed. So you've got this industrial production of wildlife. You've got viruses that probably originate in bats like SARS-CoV-2 and SARS trickling into the system and exploding into a planet that's sort of ready for that to happen with our globalized travel networks. This is a part of Yunnan province in southern China. We were able to trace back the origin of SARS, the original coronavirus from bats outbreak in China 15 years ago, to a place like this, just south of Kunming, very traditional countryside. It's probably looked the same like this for the last 5,000 years, and a bit less developed. There's forest on the hills, and there's all sorts of crops being produced in the valleys, and people living very traditional lifestyles, as they have done on this province that borders Myanmar for the last 5,000 years. In the limestone caves, you'll find bats, horseshoe bats, which carry, in this cave in particular, every single genetic element of the original SARS coronavirus pandemic strain, mixing among the bat species there. And when local people would go in these caves for the last 5,000 years and take a long, sharp stick with spikes on the end and jab it into the ceiling to pull down bats squealing and cook them for lunch, that's food. When that's then put on top of an industrialized trade network into these mega cities, it becomes a pandemic risk. And I think that's what we're probably looking at from the evidence we've got so far for COVID.
And one quick question. There would be those who would say, well, just pave it all over. The solution is to industrialize, to develop. And how does that cut against?
Well, look, to pave over the planet would reduce the risk of wildlife origin pandemics.
Because there would be no wildlife.
Very, very sad world. Number two, we would lose every single ecosystem service we get from wildlife. Bats kill insects that attack us with other diseases. They pollinate fruit trees. And for my colleagues from Indonesia, they pollinate durian, which is just about the favorite fruit of everyone in Malaysia and Indonesia. It would be a tragic loss for culture, and we would not be able to sustain our planet without wildlife at that level. So we need wildlife. We need these cultural habits to continue. And I think that, when we look at the map you showed, Andy, of forest encroachment, that is the process of pandemic risk. And those barriers to encroachment are what are protecting us from these pandemics. That's our immune system. And if indigenous peoples can play a role in that and really control that risk, they are going to save our future existence at this point.
And that's what we'll hear more on in the next few minutes. So thank you so much for that introduction. It's sobering and at the same time shows clear pathways toward next steps. Peter Veit from World Resources Institute, you've been at this for a long time as well in many capacities. And I'd love to hear from you sort of a summary of where you think we need to go from here. And we'll be talking about the new administration coming in as well and how that relates to things. But how do we preserve this rich planet and sustain our capacity for health and sustain the capacity for thriving of peoples in these forests?
So thank you, Andy. I'm sorry I'm having such connection problems.
Okay.
I hope it's more stable now. But I wanted to spend just the first couple of minutes of my time to talk a little bit about the relationships between communities, and that includes, for me, indigenous people, land management, and climate mitigation. These are really fundamental, important climate issues. We know that at least 50% of the world's land is held collectively by communities and indigenous people, and those lands sustain upwards of about 3 million people. We also know that 20% of greenhouse gas emissions come from deforestation, from agriculture, and from other land uses. And these numbers vary by region, of course. And in Latin America, for example, they account for about 40% of GHG emissions. We also know from research that many communities manage their lands incredibly well. We published a report just a couple of years ago that looked at indigenous lands in the Amazon, and we found that deforestation rates on indigenous lands in Colombia, Brazil, and Bolivia are 2 to 3 times lower than on similar lands not managed by indigenous people, and others have found similar results in Latin America and Asia as well. There's some exciting new research that was just recently published that looked specifically at the role of titling on indigenous lands in the Amazon, and they made a connection showing that titling specifically improved land management. Of course, formalization creates a sense of tenure security, and that in turn creates incentives for communities to invest in their land. In the Peruvian Amazon, for example, Blackman published a couple of years ago, showed the titling of indigenous lands reduced forest clearing by about 3/4. So it's a pretty significant finding here. And of course, lower deforestation rates means that indigenous lands often have higher carbon content forests than other forest lands. We don't yet know how much carbon is actually stored on the world's community forests, community lands, but we do know that community lands hold at least 17% of the total carbon from forest lands. And you can imagine how much more that is if we can factor in the non-forested lands as well. Now, the problem is that only about 20% of community lands are legally recognized as belonging to them, and much more of that land is, or much less of that land is actually registered, formally registered with the government and documented with a land certificate or a title. That means these lands are legally insecure, held only under customary tenure arrangements, and are ripe for being taken. In many countries, and this astounds me, in many countries, customary land is not even recognized on official government maps, and that's a travesty. We did a cost-benefit study a couple of years ago that showed that the cost to government of securing indigenous lands is less than 1% of the value of the ecosystem services that come from that land, and that making these investments in securing community land is a cost-effective approach when compared with other carbon capture and storage approaches. I have a lot more to say, but let me stop there. We can talk. I can provide more information later on. Thanks.
No, that's a good stopping place for you. But I'll tell you some of what you laid out. Those numbers, they illustrate the potential, for sure. But that impediment, the legal impediments to tenure, to title, are so frustrating for me to see. 30 years ago, I wrote the book, The Burning Season, about this exact issue in the Amazon rainforest, and some of the rubber tappers who are, not indigenous, did develop a right to get the land under their feet using the courts, but it seems still to be a struggle for indigenous people. So we're going to get to Pam and others in a second, and this is it's been a great morning so far. Norman, Jiwan, we want to go over to Indonesia now and hear from you. Whoops, let me make sure there we go. How are you doing, first of all? Can you hear me, Norman?
Sorry, I'm muted. I'm well, I'm very good, and thank you very much for this very important sessions. I would like to start by adding information about myself, that I'm now active with Transformation for Justice Indonesia, human rights organizations, and at the same time, I'm also active individual members of Conserve Indonesia West Kalimantan chapter. So Sawit Watch, I'm part of Sawit Watch as an individual members. So now I'm talking about why indigenous peoples are part of the key solutions to climate mitigation, because we have been living in harmony with forests, and we have been safeguarding, and we have been the guardians of the tropical rainforest in Borneo since time of immemorial, even thousands of years, even millennia. That is why our forests in majority of indigenous territories and landscape are still intact and still have a good forests. And Borneo island itself contains some of the world's most pristine rainforest, which has been inhabited and protected by local indigenous peoples. But this environment at the moment, presently, are under threat from continued expansions of palm oil, pulp and paper, mining, and forestry, and even this state-sponsored Transmigration Program, 2020 and 2024, meaning that is a strategic national project funded by the state budget.
And
While
so you actually, the Transmigration, could you just give a snapshot of what that program is?
But the Transmigration Program is the the program from the central government transferring people from most populated, densely populated island from Java to less populated islands like Kalimantan.
This is so. I have to comment because, and Jeff will know this, and others from Brazil, anyone listening from Brazil, way back when in the 80s, Brazil had this ad campaign. You could see big advertisements in Rio and Sao Paulo, a land without people for a people without land. There was the same thing, push people out of the cities into the forest. So we're seeing history repeat. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I couldn't avoid it.
But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for clarifying that. And the new transmigration project is actually imposing in the indigenous and people, the indigenous territories, and in a relatively high forested areas, high forested landscape. So that is very dangerous because this tropical rainforest is very important for the mitigation and of the climate change impact. While evidence from the UN and many research agencies has found that protecting indigenous people's land will help save people's life. And at the same time, giving land rights to indigenous peoples result in those ecosystems protecting health, protecting biodiversity, ecosystem services, and protecting against climate change. Meaning, titling of indigenous people's land leads to lower levels of deforestation. Our new report just launched and published today, breaking the title with the title "Breaking the Heart of Borneo," provide an insight into a series of case studies about Borneos that illustrate the impacts of massive infrastructure projects on forests and forest peoples, funded by Chinese and Asian development banks and many other private, domestic, and international financial institutions from all over the world that funded palm oil, funded pulp and paper. They are also funding infrastructure project. And the stories also reveals that the failures of Indonesian and Malaysian government to live up to their commitment to slow deforestation and respect the rights of local forest communities. Now, the global and the world is now talking about living in harmony with nature. This is what our people, indigenous people, my brothers and my sisters in West Kalimantan, in Central Kalimantan, in North Kalimantan, in East Kalimantan, and South Kalimantan have been doing for millennia. So for us, the solution for climate change is very easy and very simple. Keep the forest standing and give the people proper rights in their land, in forests and natural resources, as they have this, they have exercised their rights since time of immemorial, and they proven the best guardians of the largest remaining tropical rainforest in Borneo. I think that's this all my talking point that I can share. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Now we're going to get to Jeff Sachs, who has to leave soon. He has one of the busiest lives I've encountered. We're all busy, but there's some people who just seem to be in hyper mode all the time. Jeff, it's great to have you here too. And one thing that I wanted to, we're going to center a little bit what you're going to bring here on this new effort that you're involved with, that I was happy to play a little bit of a role in. It's a science panel for the Amazon, but you can also feel free to comment on what you've heard so far, Jeff, just in this big context of climate agreements, biodiversity agreements, sustainable development goals. Is there adequate, real concrete integration of indigenous guardianship as a tool?
Well, I think the basic point is that the international economy is a kind of juggernaut, which has been increasing human pressures on the planet for 2 centuries. But when you do that at a geometric rate, you end up trespassing every safe boundary imaginable, whether it is climate, land use, habitat, and we're not very good at self-control, and certainly among the most, if not the most, beleaguered populations in the world, almost by definition, are indigenous peoples, because their lands have been taken, stolen, wrested from them as soon as conquering peoples came to their lands. And that has been the modern history of humanity everywhere. I don't know of a country where the indigenous populations are truly empowered with the maybe some advance in recent years in New Zealand and a few other places. But if we look at the Amazon today, or we just heard about Borneo or Indonesian archipelago, and it's relentless in the United States, in Canada, around the world, while indigenous peoples were, by definition, the inhabitants of the land and remain the stewards of a large portion of the biodiversity in the world, there's no stopping this relentless, greedy, corrupt system that we have until now. And the result is that we're right at the edge of disaster on many fronts. On climate, where we're going to race through the 1.5 degrees Celsius, not even safe limit, but final guardrail within a decade or two if we don't drastically change direction. Right now, of all of the mammal biomass on the planet, 96% is either human beings or humans' livestock. So we have taken over the ecosystems for our rather short-sighted purposes, as Peter was explaining. The mega pollution of the air, the water, the soils, the oceans is killing between 5 and 10 million people a year in a normal year. The increasing frequency of zoonotic pandemics that Peter explained has been coming at us every year or two since the beginning of this century is relentless and will continue. So the challenge really is one of self-control. Can we draw limits? Can we protect indigenous peoples? Can we stop the juggernaut? Well, maybe 2021 will be better. We got rid of a psychopathic leader in the United States. He doesn't know it yet, but Donald Trump will not be president January 20th, 2021, after about midday. And he was exemplary of the lack of self-control, and he was the leader of the most powerful country in the world. But that's an example of inability of self-control. He can't control himself for one moment to the next. How is he going to protect the planet with his ignorance and his psychopathy? But 2021, we have several major global summits to do something about this. We have a World Ocean Summit in Portugal in April. We have the Convention on Biological Diversity Summit in Kunming, China in May. We have a World Food System Summit for Sustainable Agriculture in September at UN headquarters. And we have the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to commit, if they will, to reach net zero emissions by 2050 when it meets in Glasgow, Scotland in November. So this is a very big year coming up because we're just at the end of the tether. And that's why this discussion is so important and why the voices of indigenous people are so crucial for not only basic human rights, but planetary survival.
And that's a great segue, and thank you, Jeff, for being here this morning. There was one question that came in from a journalist at O Globo, asking you particularly, before we go on to Pam, about, well, let's put it in the context of the Biden administration specifically. It was a question about what countries can do concretely on this indigenous conservation guardianship point.
Andy?
Well, it's just about what can the Biden administration do specifically? In that layout you mentioned of conferences and the like, there's still, what's sort of the U.S. role, or within Brazil? Yeah. Let's say U.S. and Brazil, and we're going to talk about Indonesia more.
Well, basically, Bolsonaro was the Trump of Brazil, or Trump was the Bolsonaro of the United States. I'm not sure which, but they're the same. They're abusive personalities, absolutely nasty to minorities, to people that they don't agree with, foul language, and an aggressive anti-scientific approach, both to COVID-19, where both countries have been overrun by the pandemic, and to biodiversity, and to indigenous populations. Vulgarity. And Trump enabled Bolsonaro. Biden will say, no way, this is normal behavior. And Europe will say to Brazil, no way, this is not normal behavior, and it's not right for Bolsonaro to say, well, the Amazon's ours, we can burn it down if we want. The Amazon is for humanity. Brazil is steward, as are the other countries of the Amazon basin. But nobody has the right to destroy biodiversity or to infringe human rights or to take away the rights of indigenous peoples. And Trump was an enabler of Bolsonaro, but that's over.
Yeah, the stresses in Brazil are going to continue. Yeah, I see Peter is applauding. There's lots to, I think, potentially applaud going forward. Thank you again, Jeff, for being here.
Sorry, I have to jump. I have a meeting in Brussels coming up. So
yeah, and I just want to show folks one more time the AmazonWeWant.org is the science panel for the Amazon. There's lots of great resources there related
and thank
to
you, Andy, for all your help on that, because this is a tremendous initiative of the scientists of the Amazon region. So this is led by the scientists of the region, but you're doing so much to help it be known to the world. We're really grateful for that.
And you are too. So have a good day with the rest of your meetings. And onward we go.
Great.
And now we come to Pam's work. Pam McElwee has been involved with these big assessments, the IPBES, which is kind of like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but for biodiversity. You've been dug in around the world and looking at indigenous relationships to landscapes and how that interplays, and also what indigenous peoples can contribute directly to science, which is another arena that's really important. So Pam, I'd love it to hear from you. And you've done a lot of work in Vietnam too, not far from Indonesia. So thank you for being here again and for your patience. This is a good roster of folks we've got going.
Great. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the reports that we've mentioned before. One was, Andy, as you mentioned, the IPBES Global Assessment, and that came out last year in May and generated a lot of headlines around potentially 1 million species being at risk. A couple of months later, I was also involved in another report that came out from the IPCC, the Climate Change Panel, on climate change and land, making exactly the same case, which is the way that we treat our terrestrial land resources is leading to biodiversity decline, and it's eliminating really important carbon stocks that could help us with climate mitigation. And so we're in trouble. But the two reports also made really, I think, strong statements about indigenous peoples and land rights for the first time. And they were really celebrated, both of those reports, by indigenous peoples organizations themselves for making those strong statements. And what were those statements? Well, the IPBES Global Assessment pointed out that if we look at the Earth's terrestrial surface, 25% of it is controlled by indigenous peoples. As Peter V said earlier, it goes up to 50% if you include other local communities. But specifically for indigenous peoples, it's 25%. And there are about 475 million people who identify as indigenous people, so 500 million folks that are identifying themselves as indigenous. And so in these lands that indigenous peoples are controlling and manage and have historical use rights to, the declines in biodiversity are significantly less than outside, right? It's exactly what we saw in your visual, Andy. If you look at species level and so forth, you know, the biodiversity losses are much slower than outside those lands. And so anything we can do to help indigenous peoples potentially retain these stocks of biodiversity, it's obviously a win for the planet. But I also want to emphasize, you know, what Norman said earlier, it's a win for indigenous peoples because they have place-based knowledge, worldviews that are intimately tied to natural resources and nature. And when we see those environmental changes, deforestation, loss of species, and so forth, there are cascading effects to cultures and livelihoods. And these place-based knowledge systems are incredibly important, both for indigenous peoples themselves and how they, you know, supply food and so forth, but they're also really important for scientists. And that's something that we discovered, or we really brought attention to in the IPBES global assessment, where we use a lot of indigenous and local knowledge to help make the case for why we see biodiversity loss, what are the drivers of that, and what are some possible solutions. And so using that indigenous and local knowledge can be extremely helpful to scientists. They have different local indicators, for example, that tell us about environmental change. So from a scientific monitoring perspective, it's incredibly useful because a lot of areas, say the Arctic or the Amazon, are very remote, and it's very hard to have sort of long-term scientific monitoring in some of these areas. But local people on the ground know what's happening, and they've got their own local systems of indicators that show where we see species declines, that show where we see invasive species coming in. That can be sort of those early sentinels for pandemic risk that Peter was talking about. So these are all incredibly important, and I really wish that our governance systems would reflect the importance of indigenous peoples, both in their land rights, but in their knowledge systems and how essential they are if we want to meet our planetary goals.
Well, we'll see if we can find ways to do that. And again, we'll be talking with Mina Cetra from Indonesia momentarily. There's a question that came in. I'm going to throw into the mix right now, just because it's a good one. What role do the panelists feel the movement to criminalize ecocide may have? In other words, the rights of nature specifically. I know there are several countries that have given rivers rights that like. I'm just going to toss that in very briefly for anyone to jump on, if that feels relevant. Good question from Emma 28. Peter?
Yeah, let me just say, look, I think I can speak of this because I'm an outsider to this kind of field. What I've seen over the last few decades in my life is that, you know, very, very what seem to be out there ideas, very radical ideas like this, actually push the agenda along, even if they don't yet have a legal basis or a real chance this year or next year of being ingrained into national laws or even international law. The fact that that's an idea out there makes people think, and it drives home this message. I think one of the big problems we've got with this pandemic, for instance, is people just don't realize that pandemic risk is tied back to our consumption patterns through things like land use change and climate change. And that, you know, there's this idea in the north or in the richer countries that it's something that happens over there because people do weird stuff. No. I buy a jacket with fur on it. I don't look at the label. The fur is from a farm where they farm raccoon dogs, which carry coronaviruses, and it's part of our globalized trade. We buy toothpaste with palm oil. It drives deforestation, pushes indigenous peoples out of their lands, and drives pandemic risk. We need to understand the linkages and efforts to do things like push the ecocide idea, drive that message home to especially in the north and the richer
What's
countries.
interesting, I think we're sort of working our way down a chain or up a chain toward full consideration of rights. And if indigenous peoples can't fully have their rights integrated into law and have it normalized that they are have a fundamental status on the lands, waters that they've been living on for thousands of years. If we can't get that right, I think it'll be a long time until we get the rights of rivers straight. And now we're going to come to Mina Setra. I was just scrolling on Twitter and found this very powerful comment that you made, Mina. Some of my friends who run Covering Climate Now, a program here based at Columbia and at the Nation, had this from you, from the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago. If only the world had worked to strengthen the rights of Indigenous peoples who learn to live in nature, we would see fewer epidemics such as the one we're currently facing. So here we are today talking about this. And thank you for being here, Nina. So I'd love it if you could take the floor, the digital floor.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you everyone to strengthen the importance of protecting Indigenous people's rights. And I don't know what to say anymore, because you all have strengthened our issues, the need to protect our rights. As we are now actually Indigenous peoples everywhere, I think we are in the mode of brace for impact from what's next after this pandemic pass. Because we think that everywhere in the world, the country will be trying to rebuild the economy, and who and where they are looking for to rebuild this. There's a tendency to, again, targeting Indigenous people's land and territories for business and for investment, quick economic rebuild. Yeah. And that's really worried us everywhere. Especially when we don't have enough protections for our rights. I've been following the UNFCCC COP from 2007 until today, and I witnessed it's so difficult to talk about rights in the negotiations, and even for the rights for free, prior, informed consent, it's so difficult because there's lack of willingness. We heard commitments everywhere on papers. Companies said they want to reduce deforestation. Government said there will be more protection on Indigenous peoples, will support more funds, etc. But does it really change the situation on the ground? That is the big question, because until today we still face criminalizations, even murder of our leaders because of protecting our land and territories. And this pandemic really show us the evidence that our Indigenous people's way of life is actually the one that we have to choose. We just finished a study on the state of Indigenous food system in several communities in Indonesia. We compare the situation of the communities who still have their forests intact and the communities whose land and territories are returned into oil palm plantation or mining. And the result is really huge different. The communities whose land and territories are returned into oil palm plantation or mining right now during the pandemic are all in crisis. They barely have the food stock, and they don't have a food supply for the next few months. But the communities who still have their forests and land and territories, they can still doing their agricultures, so they have enough food stock. And what we are trying to do now is how to support communities in crisis by increase the productions of food in the communities who still have the forests and territories intact. And we start a movement we call Indigenous Peoples Homecoming Movement. It's not transmigration, Andy. Mm-hmm. This is calling Indigenous peoples, especially the youth who are in the cities, to return back to their communities to defend, protect, and to manage their territories. Build agriculture with local seed, herbal garden, so many different stuff that the Indigenous youth can do. And while they're protecting their territories, keeping their biodiversity, they can also reduce the pressure in the cities by returning home to manage the territories. So if it's in global level, it can really help reducing the pressure in the cities too. So that's what we are trying to do during this crisis at the moment.
There's another wonderful value to that youth homecoming movement you're describing. I'm showing a visual of it from another webinar. It's sustaining the cultural dynamics and diversity as well. In the early 90s in British Columbia, I was with Indigenous communities that had a rediscovery program for young Indigenous people, most of whom had moved to the cities like Vancouver, to try to get them out in the forest and understand the roots of their own stories that were being forgotten. And it was really a dynamic, important part of the landscape as well. That cultural conservation is a big challenge and opportunity here too. Well, thank you so much. We're now at the point where we're going to start to take some questions. And I would love it if any of you had questions for each other or some observation that that's emerged just in this past 45 minutes or so, something that comes to mind you wanted to share. If not, we can go to some questions that have come in. Peter, I wanted to ask you, again, World Resources Institute is such a great organization that's really focused on how do you integrate or look at policy, practices, investments, what governments do through diplomacy to drive some of these, drive progress in some of these important questions. And maybe I'll ask you the same question that Jeff was posed for Jeff from Oglobo, which is, this looks like a pretty pivotal year, but is it?
Well, thanks. 2020 was supposed to be the super year.
Right.
The pandemic hit, so a lot of these international events, international instruments got pushed into 2021, as Jeff was saying. I think there are huge opportunities with the new administration coming into the U.S. For the U.S. to begin to take some leadership in some of these instruments. We expect the Biden administration to immediately go back into the Paris Agreement, and we are hopeful that we can take a leadership role once again. But I think what is important to note is that there's such great variability across the countries. We tend to focus on sometimes on the countries that are sort of backsliding, but there are also other countries that are making huge progress on some of these issues. In Peru, for example, there's quite a number of donor investments that have moved into there that are supporting the registration and the titling of not just indigenous land, but peasant land as well. Interestingly, we talk a little bit about Brazil. Brazil is actually the only country in the Amazon that does not allow mining on indigenous lands. Now, the Bolsonaro regime is looking to change that, and there's a bill winding its way through the legislature that would open up indigenous lands. But right now, Brazil is the only country that actually doesn't allow mining and other kinds of development on those lands. So I think it's a patchwork. We probably should recognize that, and obviously over time things change as well. But yeah, 2021 is looking to be a pretty good year, hopefully.
Yes, we can hope. So let me just, on my phone here, I've got some questions that came in from journalists. So this will be kind of awkward, but everything in life is awkward these days. Question from Norman for Mina. Are people protesting against these new infrastructure projects, and what is the impact of these protests? That's an important question. Bill Lawrence, who is an Australia-based researcher who's done incredible work on charting the roads that are moving into the forests of Southeast Asia, many Indonesian islands, sometimes with Chinese investment and other investment. And the infrastructure, of course, hydro projects and the like, and in Kalimantan, there's so much going on. So is there a groundswell yet beyond the indigenous communities themselves in Indonesia? I guess that would go for Norman and Mina.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would like to respond to that. Is there any progress? I would like to share the new publication that we just published. It is based on research and update from the ground about the recent situation. We have just together with Aman as well. Aman is also the signatory of our protest, an official protest to the submitted to the United Nations Committee on the Racial Discrimination, Eliminations of Racial Discriminations. This protest is submitted to. Yes, that is the complaint that I'm referring to, where Aman and other indigenous peoples organizations and Indonesian organizations are formally submitting a protest and complaint to the United Nations Committee on the Eliminations of Racial Discrimination. So this whole project that is not only mega infrastructure or strategic national project in the all along the border of West Kalimantan, East Kalimantan, and North Kalimantan have been issued without first consultation and without proper pre-prior informed consent process. So the law that says that oil palm plantation permit should not be issued in indigenous or customary land is bullshit. This is one of good example where mega infrastructure project in the border of this Borneo, heart of Borneo, where this very good primary tropical rainforest still intact and exists. The government issued a strategic project without even consulting indigenous people, the owners of the territories. So that's why by submitting our complaint and our submission to the UN CERT Committee, United Nations Committee on the Eliminations of Racial Discrimination, the people, the group that who protest, Aman and Prince of the Earth Indonesia, indigenous peoples in local in West Kalimantan and East Kalimantan and other Jakarta-based national NGOs who support this complaint, we want the government to stop all this crazy project, all these massive aggressive attacks on indigenous people territories by reviewing all the project. If it is first, the government have to adopt the draft bill that have been more than a decade, the draft bill on the protection and recognition of indigenous people's rights as the condition. So first, the government have to protect and recognize the right of indigenous people in this territory before going further with this massive infrastructure project in the heart of Borneo. That is the new project. The palm oil, pulp and paper, and transmigration project already there. Remember when in 2005, the Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono presidential plan to open up the world's largest oil palm plantation, 1.8 to 2 million hectares along the border. We also submitted a complaint against that plan, and the government stopped that crazy plan by saying that no, that not this whole area is suitable for oil palm. The only the area that's suitable was at that time only 400,000 hectares. Okay, let's say it's stopped by not really 2 billion hectares. But now what we really protest to the what's happening in our Borneo, in our homeland, is actually we would like to show that it is not only the Indonesian government but the global, the world leaders should pay the same attention. If we are talking about to protect the Mother Earth, the planets from climate change,
Right.
we have to stop this destruction or the damage to the last remaining primary rainforest that still exists in our Borneo and other parts
Yeah.
of the world. You have to
And
stop that crazy plan.
I'd like to hear from
Nowhere
me.
to go. Yeah.
I'd love to hear from Mina on this too. And then I want to just post this news from Bloomberg, because this shows you that, the other story Indonesia is projecting to the world is to investors, to kind of to build the grand new Indonesia. And so the pressure on that end and the news coverage is often on, hey, big development, one of the biggest countries in Southeast Asia, booming economy. Mina, does it feel frustrating to see? I bet if I searched in this article, I wouldn't see anything about the forest problems, but maybe I would, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's why I said from the beginning that we are all actually in the brace for impact mode, especially when the governments adopted the law on the job creations, the newest law, the omnibus law, which shrinks 79 laws into one, just to ensure that we have as investment coming to Indonesia. It's destroyed many of our actually the rights that we already have, some in different laws, and now without the law on indigenous people's rights in Indonesia, we are more threatened with this new omnibus law, because it's really like giving a highway for investors to come to work in Indonesia.
Yeah.
And no matter how much money you put for recovering or rebuild economy, but if your economy is economic model is still focused on the macro economy, not in the building the community resilience, that will still in the long time still threaten the biodiversity, the forest, the indigenous people's rights. It's still in that sense. We are still in that bubble now. That's the situation.
So we're coming close to, we're sort of at the end here. We can go a little longer. I'm happy to go as long as folks can stay on, at least for another 15 minutes or so. There are questions coming in from some journalists I wanted to get to. But hey, Norman, did you want me to show that report that you had posted to share?
Yes, just to show the publication. I think
while you're pulling that up, I'm going to I'm going to bring in one of these questions from a journalist that came to for Peter Dayak from Mina Menon. Let's see here. Peter, she seems concerned about the pace of change. What policies or practices can change fast enough to really change these risk curves, whether it's for pandemic or loss of biodiversity or loss of indigenous rights. How can we get ahead of that quickly?
Well, we're in a pandemic that caused the whole planet to shut down for a few months at least.
Yeah.
And that time we shut down, I remember it very well in February, March. We heard these stories about the air above China become cleaner. The canals in Venice, you could see the bottom of the canals for the first time in decades. Nice. Wildlife were entering back into the cities around the developed countries in the world. And, so the pandemic gave us a vision of a planet where we are living more sustainably. Now, it's unrealistic to think everybody's going to stop traveling, everybody's going to stop eating meat and using palm oil. But what we need to do is continue the momentum, recognizing that this pandemic has taught us some lessons. What our neighbors do affects us, what we do affects our neighbors. That if we invest in structures to reduce consumption of land especially, around protected areas and around places where indigenous peoples live and manage the forests, we not only get a return on investment to reduce risk of pandemics and improve our health, we get a health benefit, we get a biodiversity services, ecosystem service benefit, and we get a climate change reduction benefit. It's an economic argument. Policymakers understand that. If there are two things that get votes for policymakers, it's the economy's stupid and it's your voters' health. That's what people care about most. There is a unique opportunity to bring this back to what matters right now. And yeah, I know it's ambitious, it's positive thinking, it's naive, but let's all be naive, let's all be ambitious, and let's all be positive and build our way back to a future that's actually better than it was before. Not the same, but better. I think it's going to happen. I think there's a new generation out there that gets it, that understand the links between what we all do with what the planet is like for us, and how that, who value a spiritually connected planet to us, to nature, to a beautiful ecosystem, more than just consumption. And I think that matters. We've got to use that, and we've got to do it in the rich countries that are driving all of this, I think.
It sounds like a very reasonable and doable prescription. Pam, I wanted to get you into the mix here too on the same question. As a scientist, you've gotten involved in that interface between science and policy and in the public, and some scientists are reluctant to go there. You're not. So, is there something more the science community can do to help propel progress here?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think over particularly the last 4 years in the United States, scientists have realized, we're needed in the policy arena. We need to push back when science advice is being ignored. And that's not something I would have predicted before. A lot of scientists wanted to sort of, politics is for politicians and science is for scientists. And I think those walls have come down. So I think it's really important that those of us that are trained in different branches of science to really get out there and make suggestions on the policy arena if we can. So just to give an example of this, some of my colleagues that worked with me on the IDBES report, once the shutdowns began in March, we started thinking about, what would a post-pandemic recovery look like from an economic angle? And will it tackle the drivers that started, the pandemic and biodiversity loss and all of the planetary crises in the first place, or is it going to be business as usual? And so we got together and we started looking through all of the proposed post-COVID recovery plans across the world for how they dealt specifically with biodiversity. There's been a lot of attention to, we need to have a sort of climate-friendly recovery, particularly around infrastructure, but we were specifically interested in biodiversity and nature. Are those showing up in post-recovery plans? And our answer is no. Right? Here's this opportunity that Peter just talked about to remake the world, and people aren't taking it. So we only found a few countries in the EU, New Zealand, Pakistan and India had pretty biodiversity friendly post-COVID recovery packages, but the US, no, Brazil, no, Canada, no. And that's concerning, right? We're going to be spending trillions of dollars over the next couple of years. Let's make sure it does no harm to biodiversity.
That sounds like a pretty great principle to start with. Couple more questions here, folks. Ulrich Prinz says, it's always stressed that indigenous people and their knowledge are so important for climate and biodiversity, but will they participate in these conferences as stakeholders? I guess this gets back to what we were saying about formalization, normalization of that participation. Nina, when you think about that and think about 2007, with the climate talks, what would the Glasgow meeting, or what would feel fundamentally different going forward in these big international deliberations?
Well, actually, we try to participate in all of the climate conference, especially the COP, yeah. And it's not easy at the beginning. 2007, first time I joined in the COP, there is no single words on indigenous at all. We were like, we're trying to look all of the documents, and there's no single words, and except it is on the vulnerable group. That's it. And then we fight from 2007. We fight in the negotiation, and our group become larger and larger to involve in the negotiations. And Paris Agreement, we managed to put to have some words on the rights to free, prior, informed consultation, something. Not really like recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples, but UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples were mentioned. And there are some progress in the UNFCCC actually, including the formations of the working group on the indigenous peoples and local communities platform, which talking about how indigenous peoples and local communities can contribute through the traditional knowledge, and how to combine traditional knowledge and modern technology to help climate change mitigation and adaptations. It is still ongoing process now, and working between indigenous peoples, local communities representative, and governments representative. It's an ongoing process. But as I mentioned again, we have different conferences, different commitments. We have Paris Agreement. We have New York declarations. We have so many of those, but it's still, again, it's on paper. The big work now is how to put those commitments into the real work on the ground, because that is all that matters at the end. We need to see evidence of these commitments are working.
I want to throw that to Peter Veit. A question came in from Barbara Fraser at Earthbeat, and I think it's, again, getting at this issue. This is what journalists care about. How do we actually do this in the world we know? And Peter, I wanted to ask you about technology. And I showed that remote sensing that was more than a decade ago, for Xingu. And I wonder, are we poised for more of that, to have a more concrete, real-time evidence of when things are going badly or going well? Is that part of what that can take things forward? And I'll show something that is relevant in a second.
Yeah, thank you. There certainly are tremendous advances in geospatial data and what we can do with geospatial data. WRI has some real core competence in and has good relationships with NASA and with the European Space Agency and with Google and with Microsoft. So we've been, I think, at the forefront in developing some of these online interactive platforms that allow users to not just see in near real time, what's happening to the forests, but other environmental aspects as well. So whether it's the Global Forest Watch program, or whether it's the Landmark platform that we manage with that provides the boundaries of indigenous and community lands around the world. Bringing all this together gives indigenous people a tremendous a tool and a tremendous opportunity to see where forests on their land are being affected, whether it's by fires or whether it's by illegal mining activities, and so on.
I'm showing, by the way, I'm showing one variation. Andrew Zolli, who's in this arena, had given a presentation in New York City, it seems like 10 years ago, showing, again, this is on a almost real-time basis. This is satellite imagery of new deforestation. So there is this great potential, I think, there.
Yeah, I just one word of caution here, I guess, is that and this sort of reverts back to what Nina was saying, is that a lot of communities, because indigenous people, because they live in very remote areas, they don't have the benefit of some of the social services that we take for granted. And so many of these indigenous lands they get no help in protecting their lands from the local police. or from the government. So many of them have to use their own ways of trying to protect their land, and that gets them into some potential serious trouble where they get their activities get criminalized. Many of them get murdered. I don't know if you've seen the Global Witness report that came out in, I think it was June or July of this year,
Yes.
that once again showed that mining is the deadliest sector for land and environmental defenders, and many of those land and environmental defenders are indigenous people. So we at WRI have become very concerned about the information that we generate and provide to indigenous people, how they use that data, and how we can provide whatever help we can to ensure that they use that data in ways that are safe for them and help protect their lands.
It seems so many things, so many tools can cut in two different directions here. Everything we have can be identify a new resource for someone to extract, or identify a problem that someone can try to address. We're toward the end of our time. This is the beginning of the conversation. Well, you know, Pam has been on here already. Peter D has been on here already. This is a running solution-seeking journey on Sustained West. So I'm hoping we can all circle back. I'd like to get some final thoughts from you all on where we go from here, and any insights that emerged from just this hour itself. And maybe we'd start with Norman. You know, where do we go from here next week? Or if I could do a session on here, focusing in on the situation on West Kalimantan, or on that infrastructure issue. What would be a next step we can take that would really move the needle a little bit?
From our webinar, my priority follow-up will be keep on monitoring and find the best way to stop the deforestation and destructions in our indigenous territories, my brothers and sisters in Borneo and all over the countries. And second priorities is I'm with Mina and others, brothers and sisters, calling for the government to immediately pass the law, the bill on the protection and recognition of indigenous people's rights that have been more than a decade already. A draft bill, never been properly deliberated by the government, compared to the bill on omnibus law, just less than 3 months already adopted by the government. And the last point is the solution to climate change is very simple from our indigenous people's point of view. My people, the Dayak Kerambai, keeping the forest standing is the solution. We can breathe the fresh air because we still have a good forest. We feel and we live in harmony with our natural, with our beautiful landscape, and with a beautiful river. And we still have that. Our brother and sisters, we still live in long houses in Kapuas Hulu district, have proven that we are the guardians of the forest, and we are part of the solution, and we have to be part of the key stakeholders in the whole process. The process should be self-determined by the people who know better about how to protect forests, and we are open to collaborate with whoever who have the same minded with us to save and protect the forest. And we'll keep fighting for our rights, and we'll keep on fighting to stop any process that is going to destroy our forest, is going to destroy our livelihoods. And we'll continue to monitor wherever the sources of financial services or credits or loans that try to finance the future destruction, we will try to stop. And that is where we can, as a global citizen of the world, we can work together, collaborate to stop that destruction. Financial institutions and the entire supply chains of the commodity, we can stop the deforestation by calling on the same message to the business industry and stop doing business as usual. That is not the solution for our climate problem. That is not solution and not the answer to the climate justice that we are calling for. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm showing here now also the website of forestpeoples.org, and folks can go there to learn more about that petition and how to protect Borneo's final frontier. Mina, also from you, I'd love to get your final clarion call on what people can do.
Yeah.
What people can do.
Actually, what I'm supporting Norman already on the needs to ensure the legal protection for indigenous peoples. But also, for so many years, we've been focused on finding solution from the city. So city-based solution, that's what we do so far. Industrial, and this is the time when we have to put our focus on finding community-based solutions. And I think that is one things that we are not do so far. And solution is there, but we need to work on it.
Boy, that recalls a conversation I had with Pam about Guatemala and people on the ground sustaining, increasing the capacity of community management of resources and from the ground up. And so Pam, what's your final thinking here? What can I do to help? What can we all do? What can the average person do to help here too?
Yeah,
sorry,
that's all right.
I hit the wrong button.
I think part of the problem is that we've asked individuals to take this burden on, right? It's my responsibility as a consumer to check the label of everything and make sure it doesn't have palm oil in it. I'd much rather have structural change. I want to see these COVID-19 recovery packages moving forward, recognize indigenous land rights, and see that as a potential solution. If we want to prevent, do no harm to biodiversity loss, recognizing indigenous land rights is going to help us with that. So I'd like to see that in the immediate short term. And then in the climate COP and the biodiversity COP next year, I want to see indigenous peoples as true rights holders at the table. I don't want them in the side events. I want them in the main event. I want them talking about how important their lands are for both climate and biodiversity, and the need for integrated legal structural recognition of these rights through both of those conventions, again, not as like a side part, but as fundamental to both the Paris Agreement and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I think we'd go a long ways towards dealing with all of these interlocked crises, pandemic, climate, and biodiversity, if we took those steps.
Peter Veit, again next week, next month, or even tomorrow, what can we do? Actually, tomorrow I'm running a discussion, a similar discussion on issues like this, on indigenous community engagement. So I'm doing something tomorrow, but in a broader sense, where do we go from here?
Yeah, thanks. So I support a lot of what everybody was saying here. Maybe just add a couple of thoughts. One is that we need to obviously provide secure tenure for indigenous people and communities of their land and their natural resources. There's often a disconnect between the property rights regimes for land and for natural resources. So sometimes you get rights for land, but you don't have the rights to the trees, to the water, to the wildlife, to other natural resources, to the minerals under the soil. So we need to sort of bring that together. But I think we clearly need to streamline the land formalization process for customary holders. We did a piece of research recently that showed that the procedures for securing, for registering and titling indigenous lands are complicated, cost a lot of money, sometimes takes decades to get, and when compared to the process by which companies secure new land rights for their investment, there's no comparison. So I think we clearly need to work on streamlining those land formalization process. The second thing I would say is that I think we need to do much more work with companies and their supply chains. A lot of companies, we did some work on mining companies recently. A lot of mining companies have voluntary standards, but those don't necessarily hold up. We need to codify strong social and environmental safeguards and laws. We also did actually, by the way, did some research on company land policies. And we found very, very few companies had a land policy. Most of them dealt with land conflicts on a case-by-case basis. And even those that had a land policy hardly met international standards on that. We are beginning to see that, some risk assessors that are working for companies and for their investors are beginning to look at land risks. And I think that provides an opening for us to begin to work much more closely with companies on indigenous issues, on land rights issues, and have them take these as seriously as they do labor issues, human rights issues, and even deforestation issues, which are now central to many of these. So I think there's a real opportunity, and maybe organizing a show, bringing in some of the sustainable development folks from some of the leading companies on what they are doing to try to address climate, to try to address indigenous and land rights issues. Thanks.
Thank you. And Peter Dayak, today you have the final word before we come to an end here. And I wanted to show your website one more time, EcoHealth Alliance, and that map, that all-important map. So hold on a second. So,
look, yeah, Andy, my thoughts are, we hear a lot of doom and gloom about the climate, about time is running out, about the pandemic. But if we realize what's causing this, it's us. And I think that there's something very positive about that we can turn the table and say, if we appreciate that we are driving this issue, then we have the power to stop it. That's an incredible, empowering thing. And it isn't just, oh, it's happening over there, someone else has got to fix it. This is all of us. It's the choices we make every single day. And my message is, to everybody, get involved in this issue, not just climate change. This is land use change. This is indigenous people's rights around the world to protect ourselves against future COVID-like events that kill our neighbors, that kill our relatives, that kill our loved ones, and that crash our economies, that ruin a year of what otherwise would have been an exciting year for many, where you're now stuck in one place, unable to do what you were going to do. It's us that can change that. So let's do it. Let's get involved and let's move forwards. And don't forget, because in 2 years and 5 years, when we haven't seen another pandemic yet, that's the time for real action to prevent the next one. And that's when we really need to focus on the sorts of, outrageous abuses of land rights that are going on around the world that we see every day. We go to our field sites year after year, and every now and again you go there and the forest is just gone, burnt down, sold off, people moved on. It's illegal, it's happening, report it, get involved, become an activist about these things. That's my advice.
Well, I think it's great advice. This has been a great hour and change here, and there'll be more to come. Thank you again for being here today. Peter Dayak, Pam McElwee from Rutgers in Norman Jiwan, and Nina Sutra from West Kalimantan, Jeff Sachs, who left earlier from the Earth Institute and Sustainable Development Solutions Network at Columbia and the UN, Peter Veit from World Resources Institute, and everybody who tuned in. This is an important issue and an important opportunity. I think you have to see it both ways at the same time. And I'm just going to close by reading something, again, from 1990. I interviewed Amancio Rodriguez. Osmarino Amancio Rodriguez was a rubber tapper, but he was also part of the Peoples of the Forest Coalition in the Amazon back in 1990. And what he said about the peoples in the forest is this: at first, the people talking about ecology were only defending the fishes, the animals, the forest, and the river. They didn't realize that human beings were in the forest, and that these humans were the real ecologists because they couldn't live without the forest, and the forest couldn't be saved without them. That was 1990, and it's a message that resonates today. Thank you all for being here. Stay safe, and keep up the good work, everyone who was on this call, and come back. Let's do this again. Particularly, I'd like to do a session with Mina and Norman, specifically on Indonesia. And we can talk, maybe I'll bring in Bill Lawrence from Australia to show some of the maps of the roads and infrastructure that's going in there. Thank you all again for being here today on this Sustain What project, which is, this is the project of the Earth Institute at Columbia University, my new initiative on communication and sustainability. What we're trying to do is find ways to make information matter and to make connectivity matter. There's so much skepticism and doubt and frustration with the way the internet works. But here we are engaged live from around the world on a really tough problem in ways that wouldn't be possible 10 years ago. So we're trying to foster that capacity and to turn it into response on the ground. That's the key thing going forward. Thank you all today. And thanks to the folks in the back who helped to organize this. There'll be more coming. Take care, everyone.